Everyone, and thank you for joining us today on today's episode of Carbon Experts Live. This is our interview style series hosted by One Click LCA, where we talk to smart people about important topics, and today's conversation is no exception. Before we get started, though, with some introductions, I'd love it if you could jump into the chat or jump into the comment section, whether you're joining us on LinkedIn or on Livestorm, and tell us where you're joining us from. We definitely love to hear where our audience is joining us from. We have audience all over the world, so we want to see where you are coming from. And while you are doing that, I will get started introducing the episode. So today's episode is titled How to Affect Policy Development and Drive a Vision for a Sustainable Future. Really big topic. I think we're going to get some good insights today from our guest, Kelly, who is co-founder at Half Climate Design, and as you will learn, has done a lot of work with other organizations and with policy development. So we'll get into a more formal introduction here in a moment, but really excited to have you, Kelly. Thank you for joining us today.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Now, this episode of Carbon Experts Live is hosted by me, Aileen Carroll, and I'm joined by Travis Dahl, who is an LCA and EPD expert with One Click LCA. Travis, good as always to have you here as well.
Yeah, thanks for the intro, Aileen.
And we are joined by our production team. We have April in the background. She is our producer. She always makes sure that things go very smoothly on the back end. And then we have Emar, who is moderating our Livestorm platform. So if you're joining us from Livestorm, he will be checking in with you in the chat and in the questions tab. So definitely put in your chat and put in your questions that you have. As we are going through the conversation today, if you have a question for Kelly or Travis, or if you have some questions right now that you're interested to know the answer, just drop them there in the comments section, and Emma will be collecting those for the live Q&A at the end. And I'm seeing some of the comments come in from where you guys are coming in from. So we've got some folks from New York. I see Los Angeles. I see Finland. I see some folks from Ontario, India. So we've got people coming in from all over the world, and we're really excited to have you with us. Now, a few housekeeping rules before we get started, what you can expect from this episode. We're going to start by having a conversation with Kelly on how he thinks about driving innovation, affecting policy development, and how to improve our decarbonization efforts in general. We're then going to challenge Kelly to answer our question, which you'll find out when that comes up. And we'll close with a live Q&A. So again, Kelly and Travis will be answering your questions live at the end of this episode. So please get them into the chat if you have questions, like I said now, or if something comes up. Don't forget to pop those questions into the chat as we're going through the conversation today. And now I will hand it over to Travis to give Kelly a more formal introduction and get the conversation started.
That's great. Thanks, Aileen. So as Aileen mentioned, Kelly's been a distinguished leader in the sustainability building design space for quite a long time. He's, if anybody here is not familiar with Kelly, he's kind of been a stalwart in the space for as long as I've been aware of things around here, so Kelly's done quite a few different things, but mainly as a senior director at Mass Design Group, he's been focused on integrating sustainability and social impact into architectural practices. He holds an impressive track record in delivering high-performance buildings that prioritize environmental responsibility and community well-being. An example would be the Rwanda Institute for Conservation Agriculture. Kelly's also established Half Climate Design with Juliet Cook, another stalwart in space, and they're accelerating whole life carbon in Canadian policy and practice. half works with architects, engineers, developers, planners, and policymakers to help integrate LCA into construction processes with the goal of having, there's a little marker to the name, having emissions this decade. So by 2030, that's the intent. So pleased to have Kelly on the show. So thanks for joining us, Kelly.
Thank you. Great to be here, Travis.
So a question we always ask, just to kind of get things kicked off, we'll get into a lot of the technical stuff, but we want to know who you are. What's your personal story? How did you end up working in construction, in sustainability? How did you end up where you are today?
Well, I'm an architect. I'm from Winnipeg, Manitoba in Canada. Grew up and studied architecture in Winnipeg and in Toronto. And I think coming out of school, I found myself at a firm that initially did a lot of work in the resource development sector. The firm was called Regional Architects at that time. Now it's SVN. And I spent the better part of 3 or 4 years around working on mine sites, working on the oil sands, working on mines in Zambia, Panama, Turkey, Mongolia, zinc and copper mines, largely, a couple gold mines. And that experience, I think, really kind of left me some big questions at that point in my career of like, where's all this metal going? And ultimately, a couple of years later, with a stint teaching, found myself in Rwanda with Mass Design Group, where the practice had been growing in Rwanda, which is a small landlocked country in the middle of Africa. Great place to understand the true impacts of buildings, because it's required us. Rwanda has an 18% import tax, which really incentivized figuring out how to make something in the country. And to do so, you had to figure out who could make stuff and what was around. And it's an incredible lesson of thinking about our choices as architects and their provenance of our decisions. And through my time there, began to understand that architecture is like sourcing. Goes back to those mines. That when you're using metals in your building, when you've got wiring, if you've got windows, if you're using rebar, ultimately, that's coming from a supply chain that's quite global. And at that moment, I think over those few years, it began to really make a connection between my experience in the mining sector and building these buildings, and how they connect geographically, how they connect financially, socially, et cetera. And finally, like one project there that we did, the Alima School, we were working with researchers at MIT at that time, looking at the embodied carbon of the project. And 2 words I'd never heard in my life. Was not a part of my education, and it was like a transformative moment for me, because it made me kind of really understand a way to quantify this impact. Had the kind of understanding it in a way that was, a number, which was helpful. And it was like a real jaw-dropping moment of holy cow, like the impact of what have I been doing all this time. And since then, I've been really focused on this question of if you're an architect, your agency is in the upfront emissions of your buildings. That so much of our training is focused on building operations. And in many parts of the world, the operations of your building won't come close to the emissions in its construction, if you're doing things right. And we historically haven't been trained to even look at it, never mind consider that the scale of those two things. And so for the last 4 years, I've been teaching a research studio at the University of Toronto called the Half Studio, which asked this question: how do we halve emissions? With the idea, we need to halve emissions this decade to meet the Paris Agreement. And half of what is the first question you need to answer. And that studio is teaching architects how to do life cycle assessment through case studies, through looking at buildings as a way to begin a conversation about where are we right now and where do we need to get to. And that led to then policy work with the City of Toronto, working with other architects, training architects how to understand embodied carbon, and how importantly, how to incorporate that understanding into design process. And so, in teaching myself this, a few years ago when I started down this road, I reached out to Anthony Pack in Vancouver, and I asked Anthony, I'm like, so what software should I use? What would you recommend? Because we had been doing our calculations in Rwanda, using a spreadsheet, and he's like, you should, try one click. And so here we are. A few years later, that was probably how I came to this conversation. But yeah, so
little shout out to Anthony Pack, who's been a
Indeed.
former guest on this show as well, and yeah, definitely he's done some great work as well.
Yeah.
I kind of wanted to move to a question that we could. It's more of a question for the end, but I wanted to bring it to the front, just because I think it ties in with some of the other topics that we wanted to talk about. We can focus this globally or on specific municipalities or regions, however you like. But what has happened over the last year, or what do you see coming in the next year or so that you think is particularly exciting in this space?
Well, I'm encouraged by the velocity of the discussion, like broadly. If I just talk about Canada right now, like my motivation to teach at University of Toronto 4 years ago is I live in London and I live in the future from some senses. I'm living in Europe, seeing what's happening here, seeing where regulations are going, seeing the kind of body of evidence developing, and then looking back at Canada 4 years ago, where there wasn't much happening outside of the city of Vancouver. I felt like this is where my energy would probably be best spent. And 4 years later, it's remarkable. We held an event in Toronto 2 weeks ago, the first National Embodied Carbon Summit. I think we had like 60 or 70 people there from all over the country, from full range of like disciplines, and from designers through builders through government, everybody who's like really invested in understanding this and how to act upon it. And so, yeah, in very short order, there's a lot of momentum gathering, and it's been really exciting to see that happen. And then, optimistically, that the inertia that we're creating here will continue no matter the political results of the coming year, both north and south of the border. That this movement we got can be resilient enough. And also, one thing that came out of the discussion the other week was the notion of political resilience. And I think that's a really important, I'm thinking about that quite a bit. Like, how do we make the issue of whole life carbon, embodied carbon, how do you sell it to a conservative is like a great question. And in my mind, it has everything to do with a low carbon economy is ultimately, one that's sourcing a lot of materials, locally or regionally. That's about job creation and about socioeconomic development, and that the transition to lower carbon materials is ultimately like very good for certainly for Canada and Canadian economies.
You'd mentioned earlier as well, as an architect, learning about embodied carbon wasn't part of your training. I know that for new students that are going through, you're involved in some of this training work as well with some of the architecture training. But when you went to school, it wasn't part of the protocol. But energy efficiency has been something that we've been focusing on for 5 decades or so. Are there lessons in that progress? Like it's taken us 50 years to get from where we were in the 70s to where we are today. I'm pretty sure the progress we've made is more than half. But are there lessons in that we can apply to the reductions in embodied carbon?
Yeah, I think the lesson is beware your blind spot. And I mean, what we need to make the leap in right now is getting to whole life carbon now. Because my fear is that, we've been looking out of one eye for 5 decades, and now it's like, oh, wow, there's another eye. We can't just we can't look, we have to see these things together and not in 2 different windows. Because prioritizing either of them by themselves has necessary, inherently could lead to unintended impact. And that looking at these things together over time is the holistic view we quickly need to take on, and getting that whole life carbon viewpoint. And in some parts of the world, it probably means dialing back our energy efficiency, requirements, and others, it's probably like, okay, push them further, like dialing that in for your climate, for your grid intensity, from your supply chain perspective. These are the regulatory changes that are going to be required of us. And yeah, because we've been looking out of one eye, for decades now, we've had a ton of unintended consequences in embodied carbon. We're using, I use the example of my cottage all the time. I wrap my cottage in extruded polystyrene thinking I was doing the right thing. I will never offset that putting that material on my building. I'd have to live in that building for 400 years for the operational savings to equal the upfront emissions of that material, for instance. And so that, I think, that's the easy one to point to, but there's, it's indicative of a kind of broader, just the enormity of the blind spot that we've been operating within.
Yeah, that's perfect. So with that and making some of this progress, how do we change our view of how we structure things in North America? Like what do you think would be an approach to changing, I guess, policy mindsets or organizational mindsets to look at things with this more, I hate the term holistic, but I think that's probably the appropriate word here.
Yeah. Well, we need data. We need proof. That, and I think the experience of the policy development, both in, that I've witnessed in Vancouver and Toronto, it required, providing enough burden of proof and like to benchmark against it and illustrate, here's the scale of the problem. And, and in the whole life carbon space, we don't, we need to work together to create that body of knowledge, that base point, that baseline to begin to say, okay, so that's, again, we are here. We're gonna work against that, and I think that's, the way we're going to do that is by working together. We can't do this in bits and pieces. We can't have firm A doing it and then sitting on that data, and firm B doing the same thing and sitting on that data. We need to daylight all of this and like compare it and work together, and move from a culture of competition and thought leadership and virtue signaling to being fully collaborative and working together to move us forward.
So coming to like a policy perspective and zooming in on some of the municipal work that you've done, whether we're talking about Toronto or work in Rwanda or wherever, there's a lot of focus on densification for a variety of reasons, whether it's economic or efficiencies in economics. Do you think that's the right approach from a carbon perspective? And like, what are some of the things that we might be missing in this thought process?
Density is good. In general terms, density is good. North America's problem. North America, I'll call it Canada and the United States. Mexico doesn't apply nearly as much, but our buildings are too big and too far apart. So densification and intensification are necessarily the way we're going to figure this out. So how do we use what we already have, and how do we add intelligently? Like, I kind of like, we don't have a housing we have a housing crisis in Canada, but our real crisis is our allocation. We have enough floor area to house 4 times our population. It's how it's allocated. So that's a kind of design challenge, and that's kind of like, if we thought about how we would intensify what we already have, and we're and densifying on top of that makes sense. I think part of the relationship between building of buildings and building of infrastructure is also critical. The problem of being so far apart is that we pave so much surface to allow ourselves to move in between the spaces we've created, right? So by retracting, by bringing ourselves closer together, you're reducing the impact of, all of the embodied and operational emissions of the maintenance of our infrastructure, which most municipalities across North America are struggling to afford right now. And that's like street, sidewalks, all your utilities, your service, your sewer, etc. All of that has a footprint. So I think that the density piece we need to look at this holistically and think about the increments in which we can add density to cities like, say, Toronto, where I'm from in Winnipeg, it's shrinking the city. It's a bit of a different question. And these more macro ways of thinking about the future of our cities is so necessary right now. I think Winnipeg's a great stand-in for most middle American cities. Way too big, totally reliant on vehicles, totally reliant on automobiles, and for my family to have their emissions, in 30 years, they just need to drive fewer kilometers. It doesn't matter if you've got an electric car that has high embodied carbon too. You just need to reduce your transportation, as well as the amount of road that we're paving and maintaining to allow you to do that. If you have the miles you're driving every day or the kilometers you're driving every day, that'll get you there, right? And that requires us to think differently about the future of a city like Winnipeg versus a city like Toronto that is looking to take in 700,000, 1 million people in the next 2 decades. Where does that go? Do we continue to build 100-story towers? If you saw the Globe yesterday, Globe and Mail article, on top of a building that's already there, that's 25 stories, where 3 blocks away there's a house that's 2 stories tall. That seems not like an intelligent way to add density. I think that if we looked at cities through a whole life carbon perspective, including transportation and all these other, including the whole life carbon of our transportation infrastructure and services, we would be distributing density, more evenly. We would be building, scales of buildings that are, 6 to 12 stories more uniformly across the city, as opposed to, 80 to 100 stories in bits and pieces.
Which ties in, I think, a little bit to the policy management. I think a lot of the time in the municipalities create a rule, like you and I talked about bike lanes previously, and let's add bike lanes. But using a city like Edmonton, for example, or Winnipeg, these places are pretty cold a good chunk of the year, and those bike lanes don't get a whole lot of usage. But also the way that a lot of the time the policies are written is, I think it handcuffs the officers that are doing the approval on various different projects to make sure that they're fitting that policy without much room for flexibility. You'd mentioned a couple of circumstances where you've got bike lanes that have to be there because it's part of the policy, but they go into a dead end crescent way that will never be used by bicycle, unless it's like somebody going to throw something in the garbage. But how are you approaching this with say the city of Toronto in proposing how streetways can be better used?
Yeah, right of ways. Well, in that project, and if you could go to our website and see it, we looked at the new Downsview development, which is the redevelopment of Downsview Airport for, I think, roughly 80,000 units. And there the question wasn't like, do you have bike lanes or not? It was the base design standards that we have for the right of ways in the city. So if you're a street, you need to be, such and such wide, and of that, there's this much sidewalk, this much blue-green infrastructure, this much bike lane, this many lanes on the street. And that's the design standard because it's a street, but it doesn't consider that the street's only 50 meters long, that dead ends in some cases are 200 or 300 meters long. And likewise, avenues that I've come to really understand how incredibly regulated North America is. It's kind of crazy how regulated we are. We think we're living in a kind of very free market. We're not. So much of our economy in the built environment is so overregulated. And that's one instance where you're just kind of following a code. Well, street must be this wide, right? That's not really thinking about, it's not context specific. And if we're going to decarbonize the built environment, we need to seriously interrogate all aspects of our existing building codes, bylaws, guidelines, because they're designed, what they've done is ingrain a very carbon intensive built environment that supports a very carbon intensive lifestyle, right? That's just it. And if anybody like leaves North America and goes to somewhere else and like sees So like, oh, hey, they do it differently. And I think a transformative moment in my life, shortly after leaving Rwanda, we moved to Copenhagen for 6 months. And that's also a cold climate. And it's also like the cyclist Shangri-La, but it was never that. It was never always that. Like in the 80s, you had to drive around Copenhagen. You couldn't really cycle around it. I spoke to people that grew up there. They're like, yeah, it was really difficult to get across the city unless you had a car. And now that's, it's very difficult to get across the city in a car, but it's really easy to get across on a bike and a train. And that was a transition that was a set of design decisions and political decisions to get to that state, right? And now if you go there, you'll see like the bike lanes are as wide as the spot for the cars. And there's more traffic in the bike lane than there is in the vehicular lane, more often than not in the center of the city. So it is a transition. I think that this, like how we use the rights of ways that we have, like we're not going to just overnight move our buildings in, but that space is a huge opportunity to redefine and redesign the way we want to live. Do we want to give over 80% of our public space to cars? Maybe not. I think COVID showed in many cases, like how great it is to have that space for people and not vehicles, right? Do we want to plant more trees in that space? Yeah, that'd be great. That'd make it more comfortable and resilient and be better for, extreme weather events. So I think, and what would that mean to our tax base? Well, and the example, the city of Toronto, 15% of Toronto is paved streets and sidewalks. And the city spends $400 million a year resurfacing them. So that's, even if you just cut that in a third, just think about that public money could be going to other things. We could be doing far different things with the cities that we live in if we simply open our minds to a future that is not vehicle dependent, and begin to make conscious decisions to move toward that future, as opposed to, and I think all these bike lanes that I'm seeing in Canadian cities are amazing. And the kind of backlash, coming from the automobile industry and their enthusiasts, it's kind of comical, because it assumes that they're taking space away from them. But, this is just the start. Like we need to be riding our bikes in winter in Winnipeg. My dad used to ride his bike, up and down Portage Avenue in the dead of winter in January and February without a bike lane. So it is possible. And the other news flash is that only going to get warmer, and there's only going to be better weather for biking year round, in these places. So that argument for like cold weather, can't bike is going to get weaker and weaker.
I forget where I saw it. It was maybe Netherlands or maybe it was Denmark. But with some of the bike lanes, the way that they've structured things is they're essentially traffic stop free. So it's, they basically have a free, unimpeded ride to wherever the destination is, generally speaking. Yep. I lived in Norway for a while and saw a lot of the same thing where, it's not as cold as Edmonton or Winnipeg, but it still gets pretty chilly there, and people do ride their bikes all year. You go to the bike shop and you see setups with, spikes on the tires and effectively an UGG boot that goes on the end of the handlebars, so you can keep your hands toasty while you're riding in the weather. So, I agree with you. It's totally possible. Some places are doing it, and really that leads into the next question of what. I think everybody is pretty familiar with the EU having adopted a lot of policies and made progress on anything related, or I should say a lot of things related to environmental sustainability, kind of leading the path and paving the way. With that comes some hard lessons, mistakes, and things like that. What do you think the EU, or the UK even, which I would say is maybe a few steps ahead yet from there, what are some of the lessons that have been learned that we can adapt to North America, or maybe some things that we would want to steer clear from?
Good question. I don't know if I'm seasoned enough to speak for like all of the EU. I'd say in general terms, I've just said how overregulated North America is. So I'm going to contradict myself a little bit in that we need to regulate. We need to regulate in the requirement for LCAs, like Finland has done, for instance. Not LC, yeah, to require LCAs, but also the creation of EPDs. environmental product declarations. So that is one, like there's the data that in doing LCA, if you're in Finland or France right now, you are relying on a fairly robust data set from the manufacturing sector, from the material suppliers. That is not the case in Canada right now. We did a whole building. We did a deep dive on the master specification for a large housing project with CureCore Architects and Brian Valentine specifications last fall. And of 625 things in the building, we could only find product data for 28% of them. So that's the gap we have. We have a real gap in EPD data in North America. And the way to fill that is I've been trying to, tell architects, ask your manufacturers for this. And the more we're asking for it, they're gonna start doing it, and that's happening. We see in the United States with the Inflation Reduction Act had a bunch of grant money to do EPDs, 250 million. That's not enough to get EPDs for every product in the country. But if we could regulate it in and require it, then it's going to happen pretty quickly. So that's a regulation I am for introducing. So yeah, that'd be the one thing we need to follow.
I think one click could make a pretty big dent with that 250 million.
Yeah, well,
yeah, but yeah, here nor there.
Yeah.
So with, I guess moving on to the next topic, can you talk about assessing past projects and using baselining to, I guess, get an understanding of where we are today and how that might inform future decisions and making better decisions to move forward from?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think you need, if you're gonna try to improve on anything, you want to, you first you set your benchmark. If you're going to take a diet, you weigh yourself. And so I think that it's important for, that's why we did the studio initially, was to start that basic benchmarking and to say, in the year 2000 in Toronto, what is the footprint of residential construction? And we looked at 10 buildings across the city of different types, and found a really big range within it, right? If you're a firm, I would encourage you to do the same thing. We'll go back and look at your past projects, look at them and benchmark and learn from the ones that are successful and also less successful about what's driving emissions in buildings. Because, all the clues are kind of in the details of that. I think in that first year, when we looked at residential, there's some things that were unexpected, that we found, like my cottage, the majority of emissions in a single family house is all in your basement. It's all in the foundation. It's in the concrete and the foam, that you're wrapping that concrete with. And that is most of construction in North America. So, that as a kind of, if you're going to benchmark against it, if you want to reduce the emissions of your next project, don't build a basement. That's simple. You'll be making big strides there. Likewise, for the mid-rise and the tall buildings, we saw similar things of, we dig really deep holes in North America, and we do that because our bylaws basically exempt the floor area below grade does not count as gross floor area, does not count as part of your coverage of your FSI or FAR. So basically, we have zoning bylaws that incentivize us to go into the ground. It's absurd. Most of the world doesn't do this. I only learned that by leaving Canada and realized, other countries don't have basements, and there's a reason they don't. And I think like that, so that benchmarking isn't just even the whole number, like, cause I tell architects, like, if your building is 500 per square meter, that doesn't mean much, right? It's where in that 500, how is it divided, and what choice could you make in those parts to improve it? So what, your envelope versus your structure is like a key thing, versus your services. And then when you look at project to project, each component of it, you'll find clues in that. The clues are kind of in the projects that are lower, of which, oh yeah, we should do that again. That's a material choice we can make again, right? So that's why I think it's important that you do that basic benchmarking, either as a firm or, as a group of architects and engineers, all the better. the more we share our data, the bigger that database gets, the more successes and failures we have to learn from.
I've got a little bit of a fork. I'm trying to figure out which direction to go. I do want just to expand a little bit on the I guess levels of detail at different stages of doing this design work. How do you feel is the best way to approach, or like how granular do we want the data and the detail on designs, and at what stages?
Yeah. Well, if you're doing to speak to OneClick, as I say, like there's a whole bunch of different tools out there, and they all have their applications in different parts of the design process. OneClick is a very high fidelity tool, where you're getting into, I use it mostly where we're looking at DD and CD sets, or, REBA stage 4 sets, end of project construction documents. And we're looking at the specification, and we are going through the whole building item by item and building, the LCA. And that gets, that's time consuming and gives you a number at the end that you can learn from. But what I think the application of OneClick can also be very useful at the early stage, where you take a part of a building. You don't have to worry about the whole thing. You just say, hey, we're thinking about this wall assembly, or here are our options for our facade systems. And you're just taking, a square meter of a wall and its layup, and you can begin to compare your options. And these are the kind of things that are happening early in schematic design, from the architectural side. So you don't need to think about the whole building. You just have to think about parts of it, because ultimately buildings are just aggregations of a few hundred details. So pick one detail at a time. And then from a structural side, it's understanding basic rules of thumb design things early on, that tools, there's multiple tools out there that can help you understand this, but it's really about volume. Like if you focus on total volume of material and the family of materials, that's where your energy is best spent. So I think LCA has applications across every stage of design, and it's how you, how you bring detail up front is one thing I'm trying to, been working to teach architects, of, learning from that, taking parts that work, and then importing that back up into the beginning of the next project.
So what are you talked about earlier about some of the implications of having our gross floor area not included any below really anything subsurface. What are some of the implications of defining gross floor areas by GFA, CFA, and how should we approach that?
Okay. I have an easy graphic that explains this. I'm not allowed, if I'm allowed to share screens or something, but I could pull that up if it's useful, or I can just talk through it. What would you prefer?
What do you think?
I think talk through it. I'm not sure that we're set up for screen share,
Okay.
so I don't want to have a technical hiccup.
Yeah, it's so in the weeds of a question, but basically, here's how to think about. We do, when you're doing an LCA, you're just like, okay, our whole building is this many tons of emissions. And that doesn't mean much when you're comparing building to building, because they're all different sizes. And so the question of what's the right denominator to divide that tons by so that you can compare project to project is a good one. And so right now, most denominators are based on a meter squared of floor area, which is how buildings are measured. When you buy a house, you're buying it based on how many square feet or square meters it is, right? That's kind of occupiable space. And in different countries, currently regulate different denominators. So, for instance, in the United Kingdom, it's gross internal area. So that's all the area inside the external walls, including all floors, right? In Finland, it's gross heated area. So that would mean more often than not, in a building, your garage isn't heated, the shed out in your backyard is not heated, so they're not part of the calculation, right? Recently in North America, we've had this discussion. Vancouver is using gross floor area. So in North America, gross floor area is like Finland, gross heated area. So gross floor area is all floors above grade, above the earth surface, which is mostly where your occupiable space is. In your house, in a single family house, it does include your basement. So, and again, it's not including the basement because the basement is not part of the coverage calculation when you go to get your building permit. Same, likewise with bigger buildings, right? Or your attached garage, for instance, is not part of your gross floor area. So the attached garage is not a part of the denominator in GFA. And my strong opinion is that makes sense, because if you are dividing it by only the area we live in, that incentivizes thinking about, the externalities of like, do we really need a basement? Do we need a basement? Do we need this parking garage? Do we need this additional space that we don't actually live in, that it basically just houses our cars, right? That is a good policy decision. That's the one that, Vancouver made. And then there's the countering argument is, no, well, we should divide everything by everything, which is, every floor area, including the garage, including the basement. And the problem in my mind, when you do that, is you're actually incentivizing building basements and garages, because the greener building is the one with the bigger denominator. And that's problematic. It's actually, it's a policy that's going to increase total carbon. At the end of the game, we want to reduce total emissions. And then a third argument is dividing it by occupancy. Forget about square meters. We should be dividing it by occupancy. So in a house, how many bedrooms are in your house, right? Like that's its primary function, you living and sleeping there. In an office, the occupancy. In a stadium, the occupancy. And occupancy, maximum occupancies are also described by building code. So that's easy to establish. And that's dividing it by people, which I think is a sufficiency argument, which makes really a lot of sense. Because if you have two people living in a 2,000 square foot house, or two people living in an 8,000 square foot house, no matter how green that 8,000 square foot house is, it's always going to look more intensive. On a per square foot basis, if it's like, a really low carbon building, oh, wow, that's a really green building. And there's one in Grand Designs here in the UK today, but it's 8,000 square feet for two people. So, I think that's where the occupancy metric makes a lot of sense.
So the well's deep here. I have so many more questions I could pick your brain on, but I think we just have time for one more. So on that note, this leads us to a cool project that I saw on your LinkedIn profile a while back, where you were using stone found on a site as the foundation. Can you talk about that project and maybe some of the lessons that you learned there?
Yeah, I mean, so at Mass, most of our projects had stone footings. Rwanda is highly seismic, by the way, so we would stone footings and then a concrete ring beam. So there is reinforced concrete in the foundation, but you're getting rid of the footings and you're replacing it with stone. And what that does is it really reduces the cost of the project in the context of Rwanda, and it has significant embodied carbon reductions. Because Mother Nature did the firing of the stone for us. Concrete is stone that's being crushed, fired again, and then reconstituted. Highly energy carbon intensive process. Not so much on the stone footings. There's some mortar. That's about it. And yeah, so we did that for Rika, and it was single-handedly the one thing that reduced emissions on that project over a kind of business as usual case. And people always kind of ask me like, stone footings, that's crazy. Like every building on earth had stone footings until about 1920. So it's not crazy. The White House has stone footings. The House of Parliament has stone footings. The Empire State Building has got a mix of brick and stone footings. So it's it's not crazy. It's how we used to build, and it's how we ought to be building again in the future.
That's great. Looking to the past to, find some solutions for the present. That's always, well, not always, but a lot of times you can find some good motions there. Like Travis said, the well is deep. There's lots of questions, and our audience has come up with some great questions. So we do want to move on to that. But before we do, this is a question that we always ask our Carbon Experts Lives guests. And that is, if you had the power to change any one thing in the industry, what would it be? So a little more philosophical.
Yeah, I kind of touched on it earlier. Like I would I would hope that we could figure out a way to be far more collaborative and not competitive. I think that that's critical for us to figure out how we're going to move together quickly. If we hold on, if we're holding on to our secrets and not sharing them, then we're not learning at the speed we need to learn. And it's critical that we are figuring out a way and a means to share the data. I mean, one thing that I'm always, excited about that to talk was like One Clicks, the publication you put out like 2 or 3 years ago, the benchmark with all the data you've got in the back end. It's great. It shows a kind of like the thousands of buildings you've got and the data that you've got. But in a lot of ways, it's just a number. It's useful as a number, but it's really hard to learn from. Again, like what was in the low buildings? What can we take from those forward? And that requires a level of transparency and sharing that's currently like, many places would point to like, well, that's going to hurt our competitive advantage, right? And I think, that might be true in the current, business model, but we got to figure out how to change that to really make the strides required of us.
Yeah, that's so important. Like you say, no one organization is going to solve the climate crisis by themselves. So we definitely
No,
need to work together. Now, we've been asking questions of Kelly, and we're going to get to your live questions. But before that, we have a question for our audience. I know Kelly mentioned data and using an LCA several times in this conversation. And the question is, would you like to book a demo with One Click LCA to see how you can use a life cycle assessment or create an EPD, an environmental product declaration? If you're interested in that, there's going to be a poll on Livestorm. You can say yes, and we will contact you to set up a free consultation where you can find out what kind of data you can have access to, what an LCA, how that could help your project in your own decarbonization journey. And if you are joining us on LinkedIn, just go ahead and scan that QR code that's on the screen now, and that will take you right to the book a demo page. So with that, let me pop this back. I'm going to close the screen now because, like I said, we've got questions from our audience. And so that will pop up on the screen here. Okay, the first one. What trends have you observed in clients' sustainability demands for architects based on your experience? And has it changed drastically? Are you seeing more requirements for sustainability?
Good question. I would I would say it would be a little somewhat cynical answer. I don't think it's changed much over the last decade, and in fact, I think that the projects that we've made the biggest strides weren't necessarily the ones we were asked to. We were just kind of working in the background on it, and it was again, kind of one piece of advice to give to architects is like, what client ever asked you what insulation you specified? I think there's a lot that we can be doing on our own, in the shadows, making decisions that have big impact without being asked to. And I think on the other end too, we need to work to inform and educate our clients and make them literate in this. There are a few out there that are requiring this of projects, but they're in the minority. And so the change is not drastic, that's for sure. I wish it was more drastic or more widespread in my experience to date. And so I'd say like our responsibility as people in this space is to help people be literate in it and advocate for change. And that's what I've been focused on over the last few years. Because if people understand it, they're more likely to ask for it.
And if I can add to the tail of that, it's not a direct answer to this question, but I think it's in the same vein and ties into what you mentioned earlier about sharing information between organizations. I think that a trend that we're in the very early stages of this, but something that I'd like to think that we are starting to see some of the early blossoms of is some more collaboration, whether it's between large organizations for whatever, let's say, large nuclear power facilities, or basically the idea that's driving this is that with the very large projects that are highly risk intensive and potentially cost a lot of money, there's a lot of risk involved and nobody wants to go first. So how do we structure things so that nobody has to go first? We kind of link arms and go together. And it's through trade organizations or collaborative projects and things like that. And I would argue that the biggest project we may have ever had to achieve is this carbon reduction project globally. So this is just a perfect opportunity for us to link arms and go forth together.
That's great. So I guess, the answer to our audience question is no, it hasn't changed, but you can be the change. So
exactly.
Yeah. Perfect. All right. And I think we have some more questions. All right. Here's the second one. You mentioned the problem of allocation in Canada, housing allocation you were talking about. How can we continue to improve sustainability in the built environment so that it remains equitably accessible to everyone? So there's that equability and access. How do we deal with that while also maintaining sustainability or improving sustainability?
Yeah. Good question. I'll answer it in a kind of like provocative way that will never get me elected. But like, we need to set maximums. It's like, why is it okay for people to have 8,000 square feet houses, right? I don't know, like the kind of minimum and maximum approach. I think removing minimums would be nice in some regards, like removing minimum parking, for instance, but not removing minimum wage. But it would be really nice to have a maximum wage, maybe, or a maximum floor area per person. I think that would be helpful. And the allocation problem is that, I mean, yeah, there's more than enough floor area, but it's not distributed, it's not distributed equitably, to use the words in the question. So, how would we ever get to that? I mean, that's where we need like a cultural transformation. And that's a kind of bigger project that's well outside the kind of scope of this discussion. But to culturally, how do we move to a place where we would be okay with less? I think is like, it's the question of our time. How could we live with less? We cannot live the way we live right now. It's like, as a Canadian, we have the highest emissions per capita of any G20 nation. And it has, because everything to do, because our houses are too big and too far apart. So if we want to half our emissions and also house more people, which we need to do, that seems like a great way. That allocation and reallocation is an enormous part of that solution. Like, how do Canadians downsize and take people in? That's a simple question. That's a simple answer, actually, right? And I could point to a few friends doing, like, showing how that could work. Rehousing.ca is like illustrating how this is possible. And that, I think, where we're beginning to reuse what we already have, adding where we need to, that's really how we're going to drive the reductions in our built environment required of us, and allow Canadians and Americans to meet the reductions required of us, because we cannot continue to live how we have lived. And we're fed a story that this is like what life should be like. Well, it can't be. I'm sorry. As a Canadian who grew up in Winnipeg and has now lived around the world, in between Norway, Rwanda, London, Brazil, and seen how other parts of the world live, I can be highly critical of Canadian lifestyle, because I am Canadian, and I am American in the true sense. And this problem of allocation it starts with a cultural expectation and entitlement, and changing that mindset. And that's a profound cultural political change that needs to happen.
I just want to second everything that you said there, Kelly. That's come up a couple of times of how do we change the mindset, the approach that, our economy is built on, I need more, we need to grow, and what this looks like to have a quote healthy economy. But there are some critical elements that are missing from that definition, but being able to change the way that we look at, what is maybe personal success and things like that, and being able to define these a little bit differently, I think is a question we don't necessarily have a clear answer for yet, but it's the question is pretty clear: is how do we make that shift and use less ultimately?
Yeah, really good points. Here, another question about, we've said cultural shift in the last answer, so this ties right in. What do you think the future looks like for trends and sustainability regulations in North America? So going back to the regulations that we need, and do you think that this cultural shift that's going to be required will happen? Are you hopeful?
I'm very hopeful. I mean, I'm definitely, I try to remain optimistic. So I'll definitely, I am hopeful. I think, it's only going to get hotter and hotter, and more extreme. And, we're going to see that every decision we make that is going to make life, more livable in the future. The trends are positive. I think, like, again, the momentum that we've seen in just the last few years, both in North America, in the United States and Canada, and then most of this conversation focused right now, certainly at the federal government level, out of the state of California, at city levels, the federal government level of Canada, at city scales. The work with Toronto was funded through the Atmospheric Fund, and their audience was like all of Southern Ontario. And it's been encouraging to see it already. Mississauga is starting to do something about the next municipality over, right? I think we're going to begin to see cities seeing, oh, yes, okay, this is how we're going to drive change. And my main message politically is lower carbon is lower cost. That it's a misnomer that the greener building is more expensive. It's not, because lower carbon buildings use less material, and that will reduce the cost of construction, right? And so if we're looking at housing affordability, a lower carbon house is a good way to get there. Stop spending money on a basement and parking is like a great way to make housing more affordable, for instance. So, I am very optimistic that this can happen.
Kelly, I reference your work a lot when it comes to cost association with carbon emissions. And that's the general misinterpretation in the market, is that sustainable, low carbon, green, whatever, will cost more. And it's there, it may cost more, but it's not a rule. And it just goes into, what are we putting in the buildings? If I were to, create a policy, I would say, let's ban forest fires. I think that's a pretty tough one to implement, though. But let's control what we can control, and look at what we actually can do, and work in that direction. So.
Well, that is a great way to end our conversation today. I mean, hopeful ending, which is fantastic. I am going to just real quickly share a couple of resources with our audience before we go. We have lots of embodied carbon policy resources on our website, oneclicklca.com/library. You can also access educational free training resources at our academy. The QR code there will take you straight to the academy page. And we do have an EPD bootcamp coming up next week. So if you want to learn more about EPD creation, sign up for that. You'll get a certificate. And again, all of this is free. We want to train 1 million low carbon experts by in the next few years. So we are definitely offering lots of free training. That's a big motivator for One Click LCA. And keep the conversation going. As Travis and I both mentioned, lots and lots of questions that we didn't get to ask, and questions from the audience. We didn't get to all those questions. So do take a screenshot here. You can reach out to Kelly and Travis on LinkedIn. Let them know what you're interested in talking about. And we have another episode of Carbon Experts Live coming up next week. So you can scan the QR code here if you want to register for that. Our CEO, Panu Passanen, will be talking to Michael Bruce of EnviMet about climate resilience and tackling heat stress. So also very important topics. And I'm going to hand it back to you, Travis, for a quick wrap up. We have just a minute left.
So yeah, I wanted to say thanks for joining us, Kelly. Something that we always like to close out in is just kind of hand the mic over to you, and if there are any last thoughts, any ideas or messages that you want to leave with the audience before we head off for the day, and I'll hand it over to you from here.
Yeah, I mean, just thanks again for having me. I'll plug the LCA for architects that we did last year. The building LCA for architects is on that we worked with you. I'd be very curious to see how many people are taking these. I think that the goal to teach 1 million people, I'm here for that. We need everybody understanding this and incorporating it in our design decisions daily. And again, sharing that information. And I'm here if anybody's got a question, look me up on LinkedIn, shoot me a message. I'm pretty responsive and would love to meet you. So thanks again for the time, Travis and Aileen, and talk soon.
Fantastic. And thanks again to our audience for joining, participating, and we'll see you guys next time.